It is December 6, 1991. Just before midnight in Austin, Texas. Firefighters responding to a blaze at a strip mall on Anderson Lane force their way into an I can't believe it's yogurt shop and find what they find. 4 teenage girls, bound with their own clothing, shot in the head, the shop set on fire around them. Jennifer Harbison was 17 years old. She was working the closing shift. Her sister Sarah, 15 years old, had come by to catch a ride home. Their friend Eliza Thomas, 17, was working alongside Jennifer. Amy Ayers was 13 years old. She was the youngest. She was waiting with her friends. None of them went home. The investigation that followed would last 34 years. It would produce 6 confessions, none of them true. It would produce 2 convictions, both of them wrong. It would send 1 innocent man to death row. It would destroy 4 lives. And the real killer, a serial predator named Robert Eugene Brashers, would die in a Missouri motel in January 1999, carrying his secret with him. He had been stopped by Border Patrol on December 8, 1991, 2 days after the murders, with the murder weapon in his car. He was released. Jennifer and Sarah Harbison were sisters, 2 years and 2 grades apart, who had grown up together in Austin. Jennifer was responsible, reliable, the kind of 17-year-old who worked closing shifts at a yogurt shop and could be counted on to get her younger sister home safely. Sarah was 15. She had come by the shop that evening to catch a ride. Eliza Thomas was 17. Jennifer's co-worker, her friend, the kind of teenager her sister Sonora would later describe with devastating simplicity. She was my older sister. She was my everything. Amy Ayers was 13 years old. She was the youngest of the 4. She loved horses and cats. She was a member of Future Farmers of America. She was waiting with her friends to go home. The 4 of them were found by firefighters in the back room of the shop, bound and shot, the building burning around them. Amy Ayers had fought back. DNA recovered from under her fingernails would prove, 34 years later, exactly who had been in that shop. The Austin Police Department formed a dedicated task force. The FBI was called in. Thousands of leads were followed. Every dead end produced another dead end. The case was one of the largest investigations in Austin history, and it produced nothing for 8 years. Then in October 1999, nearly 8 years after the murders, a new investigative team made arrests. 4 young men who had been teenagers at the time of the murders. Robert Springsteen, Michael Scott, Maurice Pierce, Forrest Welburn. Maurice Pierce had been stopped near the crime scene shortly after the murders with a pistol matching the caliber used in the killings. That connection had led investigators back to his circle. 8 years later, detectives interrogated them again. This time they got confessions. Robert Springsteen confessed. Michael Scott confessed and implicated Springsteen. Both later recanted, saying their confessions had been coerced. Both said investigators had used psychological pressure, exhausting interrogation sessions, and manipulative techniques to produce statements that didn't match the crime scene evidence. The lead detective on those interrogations was Hector Polanco. The confessions contained details that were wrong: the wrong caliber weapons, the wrong sequence of events, internal contradictions that original investigators had noticed. The original lead detective John Jones had reviewed them and said himself that there were too many inconsistencies. But Polanco's team pressed forward. Robert Springsteen was convicted. He was sentenced to death. Michael Scott was convicted. He was sentenced to life in prison. Charges against Pierce were dismissed. Welburn was charged, but 2 grand juries refused to indict him. Hector Polanco was never criminally charged for his role in the coerced confessions. Robert Springsteen's death sentence was reduced. Then his conviction was overturned in 2006 on the grounds that his confession had been improperly used against him. Scott's conviction was overturned the following year on similar grounds. In 2009, charges against both men were dismissed, because new DNA testing had identified an unknown male at the crime scene who was not Springsteen, not Scott, not Pierce, not Welburn. An unknown male whose DNA was under Amy Ayers' fingernail. A man she had fought back against before she died. A man nobody could identify. For 16 more years, nobody could identify him. In 2022, Daniel Jackson was assigned to Austin's cold case unit. On his first day, his supervisor called him into the office and closed the door. Jackson thought he was already in trouble. He wasn't. He was given an assignment. Solve the yogurt shop murders. Jackson reviewed everything. The DNA, the ballistics, the confessions, the crime scene reports. He looked for what hadn't been done, the stone nobody had turned over in 34 years of investigation. He found it in June 2025. A .380 caliber shell casing had been recovered from a drain inside the yogurt shop on the night of the murders. It had never been submitted to NIBIN, the National Integrated Ballistic Information Network, the federal database that links firearms to crimes across jurisdictions. Not in 1991. Not in 1999. Not in 2009. Not in any of the subsequent reviews. Jackson submitted it in June 2025. In July 2025 he got a hit. The casing matched a weapon used in an unsolved murder in Kentucky. And that Kentucky case shared specific similarities with the yogurt shop murders, a method, a pattern. Jackson and Kentucky detectives began working together. The DNA from under Amy Ayers' fingernail was resubmitted to an advanced YSTR testing laboratory that conducted a manual search against the unknown profile in an expanded database. It matched a profile from a 1990 sexual assault and murder in South Carolina. The profile belonged to Robert Eugene Brashers. On September 29, 2025, 34 years after 4 teenage girls were murdered in a yogurt shop in Austin, Texas, Austin Police Chief Lisa Davis stood in front of the city and named the killer. Robert Eugene Brashers, born 1958 in Virginia, a drifter, a serial predator, a man who committed at least 3 murders and a rape across South Carolina, Tennessee, Kentucky, and Missouri between 1990 and 1998. A man who had been stopped by Border Patrol on December 8, 1991, 2 days after the yogurt shop murders, with the murder weapon in his car. He was released. He killed again. In South Carolina, in Tennessee, in Kentucky, in Missouri. In January 1999, he shot himself during a standoff with police at a Super 8 motel in Kennett, Missouri. He died carrying everything he knew. He had been dead for 26 years when Daniel Jackson found the shell casing in the drain. On February 19, 2026, the date chosen deliberately, a mirror of the month's significance to Austin, Judge Dana Blasey looked at Robert Springsteen, Michael Scott, and the family of Maurice Pierce and the family of Forrest Welburn and declared all 4 men innocent. Robert Springsteen had been sentenced to death for a crime he did not commit. He had spent 10 years in prison. He addressed the court through his attorney. For decades I have carried the burden of wrongful conviction. Every day I have carried the weight of a crime I did not commit. No court ruling can return the years and the love that were taken from me. But it can acknowledge the truth. I am not guilty. Michael Scott addressed the judge directly. I lost my family. I lost my youth. Every day I have carried the weight of a crime I did not commit. Maurice Pierce was not there. He had experienced a mental health crisis in 2010 and was shot and killed by an Austin police officer he had attempted to stab. The wrongful conviction had followed him out of the criminal justice system and into the breakdown that killed him. Simply said, both the science and the confessions can't be true. The truth is that Robert Eugene Brashers is guilty, and he alone committed the yogurt shop murders. In May 2026, the city of Austin agreed to pay $35 million to be split among the 3 surviving men and the family of Maurice Pierce. Barbara Ayers Wilson, the mother of Jennifer and Sarah Harbison, had spent 34 years saying the same thing to every reporter who asked her about the case. We never wanted anyone to go to jail for anything they did not do. Vengeance was never it. It was always the truth. In February 2026, she finally had the truth to go with it. The yogurt shop murders case presents the most complete institutional failure analysis, because this case contains not one institutional failure but a cascade of them, each compounding the last, across 34 years and 3 separate investigative eras. Begin with the original investigation's strategic failure. The Austin Police Department formed a dedicated task force and pursued thousands of leads for 8 years without identifying a suspect. That 8-year absence of a named suspect created institutional pressure, the kind of pressure that affects investigation methodology in documented and predictable ways. Forensic psychologists who study wrongful conviction consistently identify what they call tunnel vision, the cognitive tendency to focus investigative resources on a theory or suspect that fits the available evidence while discounting contrary information. 8 years of failed investigation created the conditions for tunnel vision by producing enormous institutional pressure to identify and arrest someone. The Border Patrol stop is the most catastrophic single-drop lead in this case and one of the most outrageous in your catalog. 2 days after 4 teenage girls were murdered in a yogurt shop, a known violent predator with a criminal history of sexual violence was stopped at a border checkpoint carrying the murder weapon. He was released. No connection was made to the Austin murders. The jurisdictional gap between a Border Patrol stop and an Austin murder investigation in 1991, before the kind of integrated database connectivity that modern law enforcement takes for granted, allowed the real killer to walk away from the only moment in 34 years when he was physically in the custody of law enforcement after the murders. The coerced confession methodology is your most institutionally specific analytical subject. Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott, both teenagers when first questioned, were subjected to intensive interrogation 8 years after the murders by a new investigative team under significant institutional pressure to close the case. The confessions they produced contained factual errors about the crime, wrong caliber weapons, wrong sequences of events, internal contradictions. The original lead detective John Jones had flagged those inconsistencies, and yet the prosecutions proceeded. This is the behavioral signature of what psychologists call confirmation bias in investigative practice, the tendency to interpret ambiguous or contradictory evidence in a way that confirms an existing belief. Once investigators believed Springsteen and Scott were guilty, the inconsistencies in their confessions became problems to be explained away rather than evidence that the theory was wrong. Maurice Pierce is the human cost of that confirmation bias made most specific. A man who was wrongfully accused as a teenager, imprisoned for 3 years before charges were dismissed, spent years carrying the weight of a wrongful accusation, experienced a mental health crisis in 2010, and was killed by the very law enforcement institution that had wrongfully accused him. His death is not directly caused by the wrongful conviction, but it is directly shaped by it. The cascade of institutional failures that began in December 1991 ended with Maurice Pierce's death in 2010 in a confrontation with police. His daughter Marissa Pierce stood in a Travis County courtroom in January 2026 to see her father's name cleared. He was not there to hear it. The shell casing in the drain is the behavioral element that defines Detective Jackson's investigative methodology and the case's ultimate resolution. A piece of physical evidence collected from the crime scene in 1991, a .380 shell casing recovered from a drain, sat in the evidence chain for 34 years without being submitted to the ballistic database. Not because investigators were careless. Because the database didn't exist in 1991, because the technology wasn't there in 1999, because in each subsequent review the casing was part of an evidence file too large to re-examine completely. Jackson found it because he was given one assignment on one case and worked it with the totality of modern investigative resources. He found the stone nobody had turned over. Robert Brashers was stopped with the murder weapon 2 days after the murders and released. Robert Springsteen was sent to death row for murders he did not commit. Maurice Pierce died without being exonerated. Daniel Jackson submitted a shell casing to a database in June 2025. In July he got a hit. Barbara Ayers Wilson said it was always the truth. In 34 years the truth had cost 4 girls their lives, 4 boys their futures, and 1 man his life. The truth finally arrived in September 2025. It cost 1 detective 3 years and a shell casing in a drain.